The old ranger station sits at 9,000 feet, where the tree line ends and something else begins. Marcus Shepard Kane has watched these mountain paths for 15 years, warning hikers away from the Devil's Backbone Trail after sunset. Most listen. The smart ones, anyway. Tonight, 4 college kids didn't. Their headlamps disappeared into the ancient pines 2 hours ago, following a path that local tribes abandoned centuries ago for good reason. Marcus grips his radio, knowing no rescue team will venture up there in the dark. They've learned better, but these kids don't know about the things that migrate down from the peaks when the temperature drops, things that wear human faces until you get close enough to see the truth. Marcus was once a special forces tracker, but that was before the night he encountered what lives in these mountains, before he took an oath to keep others away from paths that lead to places humans were never meant to find. Now he faces an impossible choice: break his vow and risk everything, or let 4 innocent people discover why the Blackfeet called this place where spirits feast. The wind shifts, carrying something down from the high peaks that makes Marcus's skin crawl. Not a scent exactly, more like the absence of everything natural. He's felt it before, on the night that changed him forever, the night he learned that some legends exist to keep the living away from the dead. He checks his watch, 10:47 p.m. The temperature has dropped 12 degrees in the past hour, which means they're waking up. The things that sleep in the deep crevices and forgotten caves, waiting for the cold to call them down to hunt. Marcus has kept them fed with deer carcasses and livestock for 15 years, maintaining an uneasy truce. But fresh human scent on the Devil's Backbone will draw them like moths to flame. The radio crackles with static. Then a voice breaks through, young, male, terrified. "Hello? Is anyone there? We're lost and something's following us." Marcus keys the radio. "This is Kane at Station 7. What's your location?" "We don't know. We were on the Devil's Backbone Trail, but the markers stopped. There are these sounds." The voice cuts to static, then returns. "Oh God, did you see that? Jenny, stay close to..." The transmission dies. Marcus stares at the radio for 30 seconds, watching snowflakes begin to fall past his window. The first snow of October always brings them down from the peaks. Always. He thinks about the 4 kids, probably from the university in Missoula, up here for some weekend adventure. They have no idea they've wandered into a hunting ground that's been claimed for longer than written history. He opens the drawer of his desk and pulls out a leather-wrapped bundle. Inside, nested in faded velvet, lies a knife unlike any forged by human hands. The blade appears to be made of black glass, but it's harder than steel and stays sharp enough to cut shadow itself. He found it clutched in the skeletal fingers of the previous guardian, a Blackfeet elder who'd held the post for 43 years before the things in the mountains finally took their price. The old man had whispered the rules with his dying breath. Never hunt them, never follow them to their lairs. Keep others away, and they'll keep to the high places. Break the covenant, and they'll come down to the valleys where people live and sleep and dream of safety. But sometimes, the old man had said, you have to choose between honoring the dead and saving the living. Marcus straps on his boots and winter gear, sliding the knife into a sheath against his ribs. He fills his pack with flares, rope, and medical supplies, though he knows that if the kids have wandered too far up the backbone, medicine won't help what's been done to them. As he steps outside, the wind carries another sound. Not quite human, not quite animal. A calling song that seems to come from everywhere at once. He's heard it before, in nightmares and fevered memories. It's how they communicate, how they coordinate their hunts. The snow is falling harder now, erasing the kids' footprints and making the trail treacherous. But Marcus knows these paths better than his own heartbeat. He's walked them in darkness and daylight, in summer heat and winter storms, always watching, always keeping the boundary. Tonight, he crosses it. His radio squawks one final time as he reaches the trailhead. The same terrified voice, but weaker now, more distant. Something touched Jenny. She doesn't look right anymore. Her eyes are, silence. Marcus adjusts his headlamp and steps onto the Devil's Backbone trail. Behind him, the ranger station's lights fade into swirling snow. Ahead, the path winds upward into darkness that seems to swallow light itself. Somewhere in that darkness, 4 kids are learning why some trails were never meant for human feet. And somewhere else, ancient things are stirring, tasting the air for the scent of the guardian who just broke his sacred oath. The old man's eyes tracked the group as they disappeared around the granite outcropping, their voices fading into the whisper of wind through pine needles. Marcus Thorne remained motionless for several minutes, his weathered hands gripping the wooden staff that had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather before him. 4 generations of Thornes had kept the vigil, and now the burden fell to him alone. He turned his gaze toward the forbidden trail, barely visible through the undergrowth 30 yards to the north. No marker designated its entrance, deliberately so. The Forest Service maps showed nothing but wilderness in that direction, a blank space where cartographers had been instructed to leave empty. Only Marcus knew the truth about what lay beyond those shadows. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest trace of something that made his skin crawl. Decay, ancient malevolence. The scent meant they were stirring again, drawn by the presence of young blood in their territory. Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his chest like a stone. He'd been 17 when his grandfather first brought him to this mountain, explaining the sacred duty that had been passed down through their bloodline. The Watchers sleep, but they never die, the old man had whispered, his voice hoarse with the weight of decades keeping the secret. And something still hunts in their name. That was 43 years ago. 43 years of turning away curious hikers, of maintaining the carefully constructed barriers, both physical and spiritual, that kept the darkness contained. 43 years of sleepless nights when the moon was dark and things moved in the forest that had no business moving. Marcus pulled his radio from his belt and switched to the emergency frequency. Static crackled for several seconds before a voice responded. Forest Service. This is Ranger Walsh. Tom, it's Marcus. I've got a situation developing on the north face. A pause. Tom Walsh was new to the area, transferred from Colorado just 6 months ago. He knew Marcus by reputation, the hermit who lived alone in his cabin, who seemed to know everything that happened in these mountains. But he didn't know the truth. Very few people did. What kind of situation, Marcus? Group of college kids, 6 of them. They're heading toward restricted territory. I'll send a patrol up to redirect them. No, Marcus's voice was sharp. Too late for that. Just keep everyone else off the mountain tonight. Make up whatever excuse you need to. Equipment malfunction, bear activity, I don't care. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus, what aren't you telling me? The question hung in the air like smoke. How could he explain that some boundaries existed for reasons that had nothing to do with environmental protection or public safety? How could he make anyone understand that certain places on this earth were meant to remain undisturbed? That some doors should never be opened? Just trust me, Tom. One night. Keep people away for one night. Marcus switched off the radio before Walsh could respond. He walked to the edge of the clearing where his cabin sat, its logs silvered with age and weather. Behind it, barely visible through a stand of aspen trees, stood a smaller structure that most visitors assumed was a storage shed. Marcus approached it now, his footsteps heavy with reluctance. The building was older than his cabin, constructed from stones that predated European settlement by centuries. His great-grandfather had built the cabin around it, incorporating the ancient structure into their homestead like a dark heart at its center. Symbols were carved deep into the stone, not Native American, though the local tribes had known enough to avoid this place entirely. These markings were older, from a time when different things had walked the earth. Marcus withdrew an iron key from beneath his shirt, where it hung on a cord next to his grandfather's silver cross. The lock was modern, but what it protected was not. Inside the stone structure, mounted on the far wall, hung an array of items that would have looked like museum pieces to an untrained eye. A bow carved from mountain ash, its string woven from materials he preferred not to think about. Arrows tipped with points of obsidian and blessed silver. Vials of substances that caught and held moonlight like liquid stars, and hanging in the center, wrapped in oiled leather, was the blade. Marcus had hoped never to touch it again. The last time had been 8 years ago, when a family of 4 had ignored his warnings and set up camp near the old stone circle. He'd been too late to save them all. The memory of what he'd found in that clearing still visited his dreams. But tonight, as darkness began to gather in the valleys below and the temperature dropped with unnatural suddenness, Marcus unwrapped the ancient weapon. Its edge gleamed with a light that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening wind, came the sound of young voices calling out in what might have been excitement or fear. Marcus stepped out of the stone building and began walking toward the forbidden trail. The ancient pines whispered secrets older than civilization, as Marcus led his friends deeper into the Bitterroot Range. The warning from the strange man at the trailhead had already faded to little more than an amusing anecdote, something to joke about around their campfire later. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, painting their path in dappled light that made everything seem harmless and inviting. "I still can't believe that guy," Sarah laughed, adjusting her designer hiking boots that were already giving her blisters. "Did you see his eyes? Like he hadn't slept in years." "Probably some burned-out hippie who's been living off the grid too long," Marcus replied, consulting his GPS watch. "These mountains are full of them, hermits who think they own the wilderness." Behind them, Kyle struggled with his overloaded pack, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Maybe we should have listened. I mean, what if he knows something we don't?" "Like what?" Emma shot back, her camera clicking constantly as she documented their adventure for social media. "That Bigfoot lives up here? Come on, Kyle. We're not exactly helpless city kids." But they were, and deep in the forest, something ancient stirred at their presence. The trail began to change as they climbed higher. What had started as a well-maintained path gradually became little more than an animal track, winding between moss-covered boulders and fallen logs that seemed strategically placed to block their way. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead until only scattered fragments of sky remained visible. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Lisa asked, her voice carrying a tremor she tried to hide. Unlike the others, she'd grown up in rural Montana, and her grandfather had filled her childhood with stories of things that dwelled in the deepest parts of the mountains. Things that predated the arrival of European settlers, things that the native tribes had known to fear and respect. "The GPS shows we're still on track," Marcus insisted, though privately he noticed that the device seemed to be losing signal with increasing frequency. The needle spun wildly before settling on directions that felt wrong somehow, as if the very mountain was trying to mislead them. As the afternoon wore on, the forest around them seemed to grow more oppressive. The cheerful bird songs that had accompanied their early ascent faded to silence. Even the wind seemed muted, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Emma's camera began malfunctioning, producing images that showed dark shapes lurking just outside the frame, shapes that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. "Did anyone else notice we haven't seen any other hikers?" Jake observed, breaking a silence that had stretched uncomfortably long. "I mean, it's prime hiking season. There should be people everywhere. Maybe because locals know better," Lisa muttered under her breath, earning sharp looks from the others. The path forked ahead, splitting around a massive granite outcropping carved with symbols that predated any known Native American markings in the region. The left fork continued upward, steep but navigable. The right fork descended into a ravine thick with shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying trees. Marcus consulted his GPS again, frowning at the scrambled display. "According to this, both paths lead to the same place eventually. We should take the high road, better views for photos." But as he spoke, A sound drifted up from the ravine. Low and resonant, it might have been wind through stone crevices or the call of some animal they couldn't identify. It seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, creating a disorienting symphony that made their inner ears ache. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, instinctively moving closer to the group. "Probably just a bear," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. Bears didn't make sounds like that, sounds that seemed almost like language, like something attempting to communicate across an impossible gulf of understanding. Lisa felt ice forming in her stomach as childhood memories surfaced unbidden. Her grandfather's voice, weathered and serious. "There are places in these mountains where the old things still walk, little one. Places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The smart ones know to turn back when the forest goes quiet." The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, something like copper and ozone, with an underlying sweetness that spoke of decay. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and their breath began to mist despite the late afternoon warmth they'd been enjoying moments before. "We should go back," Lisa said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Go back?" Marcus laughed, but the sound was forced. "We've hiked 6 miles. We're not turning around because of some weird animal noise." Above them, the first clouds began gathering around the mountain peaks, moving with unnatural speed against the prevailing winds. In the gathering gloom, none of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above, a lone sentinel whose weathered face was etched with growing concern as he realized they'd passed the final boundary. The forbidden ground had claimed new prey. The temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment they crossed the tree line marked by ancient stones. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, watching her breath form crystalline clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The stones themselves seemed wrong, not stacked by human hands, but grown from the earth in deliberate patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Anyone else feel that?" Marcus whispered, his usual bravado cracking. "It's just the altitude," Jenna said, but her voice wavered. She clutched her camera like a talisman, though she hadn't taken a single photo since they'd passed the strange markers. David checked his GPS again, frowning at the blank screen. "This thing's completely dead. Not just low battery, dead, like something fried the circuits." He shook it, then stuffed it back into his pack with more force than necessary. The trail ahead disappeared into a grove of pine trees so dense they blocked out the afternoon sun. Between the trunks, shadows moved in patterns that defied the wind. Sarah counted her heartbeats, trying to convince herself the darkness was just playing tricks, but the shadows definitely moved independently of the swaying branches above. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, hating how small her voice sounded. "We've gotten some good shots already, and the light's going to be gone soon anyway." "Are you serious?" Marcus forced a laugh that echoed strangely among the trees. "We came all this way for what? A few pictures of regular mountains. The real payoff is up there." He pointed toward the peaks barely visible through the canopy. "Besides, that old guy was probably just trying to scare us. Local color and all that." But even as he spoke, Marcus's hand drifted to the bear spray on his belt. Sarah noticed his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the canister's outline. A sound drifted down from the trail ahead, like wind through dry leaves, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like whispering or breathing. "Did you guys hear that?" Jenna's camera hung forgotten around her neck now. They all froze, listening. The sound came again, definitely not wind. It seemed to circle them, moving from tree to tree with impossible speed. David pulled out his flashlight, even though daylight still filtered through the branches. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but empty forest floor carpeted with pine needles. "There's nothing there," he said, but kept the light on. Sarah's skin crawled as she realized she could feel eyes watching them. Not the casual observation of forest animals, but something intelligent and hungry, something that had been waiting. "The old man mentioned spirits," she said quietly. What if he wasn't just talking folklore? What if there's really something up here? Marcus scoffed, but it sounded forced. You want to let some crazy hermit's ghost stories ruin our trip? Come on, Sarah. You're studying psychology. You know how the mind can play tricks in unfamiliar environments. A branch snapped somewhere to their left, too loud and deliberate to be natural settling. Then another to their right. The sound was moving, circling closer. David's flashlight beam swept wildly between the trees. Okay, maybe we should... The whispering sound erupted from all around them at once, no longer subtle or distant. It filled the air like static electricity, raising the hair on their arms and making their teeth ache. The temperature plummeted further, and Sarah's breath came out in thick white puffs. Through the cacophony of otherworldly voices, one sound cut clear and human. Footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, moving fast and purposeful. This way, now. The Guardian emerged from the tree line like he'd materialized from shadow itself. His weathered face was grim, and he carried a rifle that looked older than the mountains themselves. Strange symbols were carved into its wooden stock, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when Sarah looked at them directly. I told you not to come here, he growled, but there was no anger in his voice now, only urgency. The boundary stones, you crossed them, didn't you? The whispering intensified, and the shadows between the trees began to coalesce into shapes that made Sarah's mind recoil. Too many limbs, too many angles, forms that belonged to no earthly creature. What are those things? Jenna's voice cracked with terror. Hungry, the Guardian replied, raising his rifle. And you just rang the dinner bell. The weapon discharged with a sound like thunder, but the muzzle flash revealed symbols carved into the bullet itself, glowing white-hot as it tore through the air. One of the shadow shapes shrieked and dissolved, but three more took its place. Stay close to me, the Guardian commanded, working the bolt action with practiced speed. And whatever you do, don't look directly at them. They feed on fear, but they feast on understanding. Sarah grabbed Jenna's hand and pulled her toward the Guardian's position. Behind them, the whispering grew hungry. The ancient oak's bark felt rough against Marcus's weathered palm as he pressed his hand to its trunk, closing his eyes and extending his senses into the mountain's depths. The whispers came immediately, not words, but impressions that crawled through his consciousness like ice water through his veins. Something had stirred in the deep places, something that should have remained dormant until the new moon passed. His eyes snapped open, pupils dilating as supernatural sight overlaid his natural vision. Threads of malevolent energy snaked through the forest like luminescent veins, all converging on a point 3 miles northeast. The Forbidden Trail. Marcus's jaw clenched as he recognized the familiar signature of human terror bleeding into the spiritual realm. They hadn't listened. Marcus broke into a run, his boots finding purchase on stones and roots that would have sent a normal man tumbling into the ravine below. Branches whipped past his face as he navigated the treacherous terrain with inhuman grace, his enhanced senses tracking the growing disturbance ahead. With each stride, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The first scream reached his ears as he crested a rocky outcrop. Human, female, terror so pure it made his teeth ache. Marcus vaulted over a fallen log and landed in a crouch, scanning the darkness ahead. There, flickering orange light through the trees. A campfire, exactly where he'd feared he would find one. As he approached the edge of their camp, Marcus caught fragments of panicked voices carried on the mountain wind. Something in the trees, I swear I saw. Sarah, calm down. It was probably just... No, it had eyes like stars, and when it looked at me I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Marcus positioned himself behind a cluster of pine trees, studying the group. 5 college students huddled around a struggling fire, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear. The girl called Sarah sat wrapped in a sleeping bag, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the tree line. Even from this distance, Marcus could smell the acrid scent of otherworldly contact clinging to her. A low growl echoed from somewhere beyond the camp's meager circle of light, and all 5 students froze. Marcus felt his blood turn to slush. That sound didn't come from any earthly predator. The hollow ones were already hunting. "We need to leave," whispered a dark-haired boy, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Pack everything now and get back to the main trail." "In the dark?" another protested. "We'll get lost or fall off a cliff. Better than staying here," Sarah said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "It's still out there, watching us. I can feel it." She was right. Marcus could sense them too, 3 distinct presences circling the camp like sharks around a sinking ship. The hollow ones were patient hunters, feeding on fear before claiming their prey. They would toy with the students until despair overwhelmed them completely, then move in for the final harvest. Marcus closed his eyes and touched the leather cord around his neck, feeling the weight of the bone amulet that had bound him to this mountain for 37 years. His oath was clear: observe, guide, protect from a distance. Never reveal himself, never interfere directly. The ancient compact that kept the deeper evils at bay depended on his adherence to these sacred rules. But watching innocent children die had never been part of the bargain. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the fire, followed by a sound like wind through a hollow skull. One of the boys grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the tree line, the beam trembling in his grip. The light caught something pale moving between the trees, a glimpse of elongated limbs and 2 sharp angles before it melted back into shadow. "Oh God," someone whimpered. What was that thing? Marcus felt the familiar burn of supernatural energy building in his chest, power he hadn't unleashed in over a decade. The mountain spirits were restless, sensing the approaching violation of his oath. But as he watched the students huddle closer together, their terror bleeding into the night like an open wound, he made his choice. The bone amulet grew hot against his chest as he stepped into the firelight, his sudden appearance causing 2 of the students to cry out in alarm. Marcus stood at the edge of their camp, his weathered face grim in the dancing shadows, and spoke the words that would shatter his sacred bond. "Get behind me," he said, his voice carrying an authority that cut through their panic like a blade. "And whatever happens next, don't look directly at them. The human mind isn't meant to comprehend what you're about to see." The temperature around the camp plummeted 20 degrees in an instant, and from the darkness came an answering call, a sound like the death rattle of ancient gods. The real hunt was about to begin. The ancient cave system stretched deeper into the mountain than Marcus had ever ventured before. His flashlight beam cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing smooth stone walls that bore the scars of something far older than human civilization. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something that made his skin crawl with primal recognition. Behind him, the college students huddled together in terrified silence. Sarah clutched her injured arm, the makeshift bandage already seeping through with fresh blood. The twins, Jake and Connor, stayed close to their sister, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Only Emma seemed to maintain any composure, though Marcus could see the tremor in her hands as she gripped her phone's dying light. "How much further?" Jake whispered, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. Marcus held up a hand for silence. In the distance, something scraped against stone, a sound like claws dragging across granite. The stalkers were tracking them, following the scent of blood and fear that clung to the group like a beacon in the darkness. "They're persistent," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to the students. "Haven't seen them hunt this aggressively in decades." "What are those things?" Emma finally asked, her academic curiosity overriding her terror. Marcus paused at a fork in the tunnel system. To the left, the passage sloped upward toward what might be another exit. To the right, it descended into absolute blackness. He knew both paths intimately, had mapped every inch of these caves during his long years as guardian. The left path would take them closer to the surface, but it was narrow, with multiple choke points where the stalkers could corner them. The right path led to the deep chamber. "They're what remains of the first settlers who came to these mountains," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. "The ones who found what should have stayed hidden." Sarah whimpered as another scraping sound echoed from behind them, closer this time. They're going to catch us. Not if I can help it. Marcus made his decision and started down the right passage. Stay close. Don't make any unnecessary noise, and whatever you see down here, don't look directly at it. The descent was treacherous, with loose stones that threatened to betray their position with every step. Marcus's enhanced senses picked up the subtle changes in air pressure, the shift in temperature that indicated they were approaching the mountain's heart. His oath as guardian had bound him to these tunnels for more years than he cared to remember, but he had never brought outsiders this deep before. The passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. Ancient symbols covered the walls, not carved, but burned into the stone as if by intense heat. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained black with centuries of offerings. Jesus Christ, Connor breathed, forgetting Marcus's warning about silence. The blasphemy echoed through the chamber, and immediately the symbols on the walls began to pulse with a faint, sickly light. Marcus spun around, his eyes flashing with an anger that made the students step back in fear. "I told you to stay quiet," he hissed. "This place responds to certain words, certain thoughts. It's been sleeping, and I intended to keep it that way." But it was too late. The pulsing light grew stronger, and from somewhere in the darkness above came a sound like wings, massive, leathery wings that displaced air with each beat. The students pressed together, their terror now absolute. "What have we done?" Emma whispered. Marcus moved to the altar, running his hands over symbols that seemed to writhe under his touch. "You've awakened something that should have stayed buried, something that makes the stalkers look like house cats." The wing beats grew closer, accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision. For 60 years he had maintained the balance, kept the ancient evils contained while protecting the innocent who wandered too close. But bringing outsiders into the deep chamber, that was a violation that would have consequences far beyond tonight. "There's another way out," he said finally, pointing to a narrow crevice in the far wall. "But it means going deeper, into parts of the mountain that haven't seen light since the world was young." "What about you?" Sarah asked, seeing something final in his expression. Marcus smiled grimly, his hand moving to the leather pouch at his belt, the one that contained the tools of his guardianship, the artifacts that bound him to his oath. "Someone needs to reseal this chamber. Someone needs to send our friend back to sleep." The wing beats were directly overhead now, and the temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably. Ice began forming on the stone walls. "Go," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Now, before it fully manifests." The temperature plummeted as darkness claimed the mountainside, and Sarah's breath came in sharp puffs of vapor that dissipated into the frigid air. The group huddled closer to their pathetic campfire, the flames dancing weakly against the oppressive night that seemed to press in from all sides. Marcus had managed to get a decent blaze going using pine needles and dry bark, but the fire felt insignificant against the vast wilderness surrounding them. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling wood. They all strained to listen. At first, there was nothing but the natural symphony of the mountain night. Whined through the pines, the distant hoot of an owl, the settling of cooling rocks. Then it came again, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them, reverberating through their bones. "Probably just wolves," Tyler said, though his usual confidence had evaporated hours ago when they'd realized the trail markers had vanished. "Mountain wolves make weird sounds." Sarah wasn't convinced. She'd heard wolves before during camping trips with her family, and this was something else entirely. Something that made her skin crawl and her primitive brain scream warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The sound held an intelligence that was distinctly non-animal, yet unmistakably predatory. Marcus fed another branch to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward into the star-studded sky. "We should take turns keeping watch," he suggested, "just to be safe." "Watch for what?" Amy asked, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. That crazy hermit? Wild animals? I mean, what exactly are we supposed to be afraid of out here? Before anyone could answer, the forest around them fell into an unnatural silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been, as if every living creature had either fled or was hiding from something terrible. That's when they saw the eyes. They appeared first as pinpricks of amber light in the tree line, barely visible between the dark silhouettes of pine trunks. Sarah counted at least 6 pairs, maybe more, hovering at roughly human height, but somehow wrong in their spacing and intensity. The eyes didn't reflect the firelight like those of normal animals. They seemed to generate their own malevolent glow. "Nobody move," Marcus breathed, his hands slowly reaching for the hunting knife clipped to his belt. "Just stay calm and don't make eye contact." But it was too late for that advice. The eyes had already seen them, studied them, and found them wanting. A new sound emerged from the darkness. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something that incorporated the worst elements of both. It was followed by the unmistakable crack of breaking branches as multiple large forms began moving through the forest, circling their small camp. Jessica started to hyperventilate, her breath coming in rapid, panicked gasps. "This isn't happening," she whispered. "This isn't real." The fire suddenly flared higher without any additional fuel, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. In those dancing shadows, Sarah caught glimpses of shapes that her mind refused to fully process. Elongated limbs, faces that were almost human but stretched and distorted, fingers that ended in curved talons. Tyler slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and careful. "We need to get out of here, now." "And go where?" Amy hissed. "We don't even know which direction leads back to the main trail." That's when the old man stepped into the circle of firelight. He moved with surprising silence for someone of his apparent age, emerging from the darkness as if he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. His weathered face was grim, and his eyes held the kind of hard knowledge that came from witnessing unspeakable things. In his hands, he carried what looked like an ornate walking stick, but Sarah could see strange symbols carved along its length that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice carrying easily over the crackling fire. "The hollowed ones have caught your scent. They've been waiting." "The what?" Marcus demanded, his knife now fully drawn. The old man ignored the question, instead raising his staff and speaking words in a language that predated any human tongue. The symbols along the staff blazed brighter, and the amber eyes in the forest suddenly withdrew, accompanied by sounds of rage and frustration. "That won't hold them long," he said, lowering the staff. "They're bound to this place, but they're also hungry. They haven't fed in decades." Sarah found her voice. "You're him, the Guardian, the one the ranger warned us about." He nodded grimly. "Josiah Blackwood, and you 5 are about to learn why some trails are forbidden." He looked directly at each of them in turn, his gaze heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "The question now is whether you're worth breaking a century-old oath to save." The ancient thing that had once been human moved through the trees with predatory grace, its elongated limbs bending at impossible angles as it navigated the dense undergrowth. Sarah pressed herself against the rough bark of a massive pine, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. The creature's breathing was a wet, rattling sound that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. 20 feet away, Marcus crouched behind a fallen log, his face pale in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. Their eyes met across the small clearing, and she could see her own terror reflected in his gaze. They had been running for what felt like hours since the thing had found their campsite, following Emma's screams into the darkness. The memory of their friend's face, twisted in agony as something invisible tore at her flesh, made Sarah's stomach lurch. They had tried to help her, but the mysterious guardian had appeared from nowhere, shouting at them to run while he fought off whatever was attacking Emma. The last thing Sarah had seen was his weathered face, grim with determination, before Marcus had grabbed her hand and pulled her into the forest. Now they were lost, separated from Jake and the others, with this nightmare creature hunting them through the trees. Sarah could hear it moving again, its claws scraping against bark as it tested the air with that horrible snuffling sound. The smell that preceded it was overwhelming, decay and ancient earth, and something else that made her primitive brain scream warnings. The creature paused directly in front of her hiding spot. Through a gap in the lower branches, Sarah could see its legs, which had once been human but were now stretched and distorted, the bones visible through translucent skin. Patches of dark fur sprouted randomly across the pallid flesh, and its feet had elongated into something resembling hooves, though sharp talons protruded from what might have been toes. Sarah bit down on her knuckle to keep from making any sound as the thing's head descended into view. What she saw made her mind recoil in horror. The face retained enough human features to be recognizable as such, but they were all wrong. The eyes too large and completely black, the mouth stretched wide to accommodate rows of needle-sharp teeth. Strips of flesh hung from its cheeks like tattered curtains, revealing the bone beneath. The creature's head turned with mechanical precision, scanning the area where she hid. Those dead black eyes seemed to look directly at her, and Sarah was certain she had been discovered. But then, a sound echoed through the forest, a low, resonant horn that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The creature's head snapped up, its attention diverted, and it released a shriek of frustration that made Sarah's ears ring. Without warning, the Guardian materialized from the shadows like smoke given form. He moved with impossible speed and silence, his weathered features set in grim determination. In his hands was a weapon Sarah had never seen before, a staff topped with carved symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The markings pulsed in rhythm with the strange horn call that continued to echo through the trees. The creature wheeled to face this new threat, its body contorting as it prepared to attack. But the Guardian was already in motion, the glowing staff cutting through the air in complex patterns that left trails of silver light. Where the light touched the creature's flesh, it sizzled and smoked, drawing forth screams of rage and pain. "The old paths are forbidden to you." The Guardian's voice carried a weight of authority that seemed to press against Sarah's consciousness. "Return to your slumber, or face the consequences of your defiance." The creature circled him like a predator, looking for an opening, but the Guardian's movements were fluid and precise, each gesture of his staff creating barriers of light that the thing could not cross. Sarah realized she was witnessing something far older than any human conflict, a battle between forces that had been playing out in these mountains since before recorded history. Marcus caught her attention with a subtle gesture, pointing toward a gap in the trees where the moonlight revealed what might be a trail. They could escape while the Guardian held the creature's attention, but Sarah hesitated. Running felt like abandonment, leaving their protector to face this horror alone. The decision was made for her when the Guardian's voice cut through the night, speaking directly into her mind without his lips moving. "Go, find the others. This is only the beginning." The creature lunged forward with inhuman speed, but the Guardian was ready. The staff blazed with brilliant light as he met the attack head-on, and the resulting impact sent shockwaves through the forest that shook the very ground beneath Sarah's feet. She needed no further encouragement. Grabbing Marcus's hand, she sprinted toward the moonlit gap in the trees, the sounds of supernatural battle raging behind them. Whatever ancient evil had awakened in these mountains, she prayed the Guardian's power would be enough to contain it. The screaming started before dawn. Marcus jolted awake in his sleeping bag, the sound cutting through the thin mountain air like a blade. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The voice cracked and warped, stretching into something that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking the girl beside him. But when he turned, her sleeping bag was empty, the fabric still warm. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting skeletal shadows that danced across the campsite. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, hands trembling as the beam swept across empty spaces where his friends should have been. Jake's tent hung open like a gaping mouth. Emma's backpack lay overturned, contents scattered across the pine needles. Another scream echoed from deeper in the forest, followed by a sound like breaking glass, if glass could weep. Marcus scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over the roots that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. The old man's warnings echoed in his memory. Don't leave the marked trail. Don't travel after sunset. Don't trust the voices in the dark. They'd laughed at him then, dismissing him as another crazy mountain hermit. Now Marcus would have given anything to see that weathered face emerge from the tree line. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But the air had changed, thick with the scent of copper and something else, something ancient and rotten, like flowers left too long in a tomb. "Jake," Marcus called softly. "Emma." The forest swallowed his words without echo. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Marcus turned the light toward it and caught a glimpse of pale skin between the trees. Relief flooded through him until he realized the skin was moving wrong, undulating like water, stretching in directions that defied anatomy. He ran. Branches clawed at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, following what he hoped was the trail back down the mountain. Behind him, something laughed, a sound like wind through broken bones. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating a strobing nightmare of reaching shadows and twisted bark that looked too much like grasping fingers. His foot caught on an exposed root, and he went down hard, the flashlight spinning away to land face down in the dirt. Darkness closed around him like cold water. Marcus pressed his face against the earth, pine needles sharp against his cheek, and tried not to breathe. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. But there were too many of them, as if something was walking on more legs than it should have. "Marcus," Sarah's voice drifted through the trees, sweet and familiar. "Marcus, where are you? I'm scared." He squeezed his eyes shut. Sarah never called him by his full name. It was always Mark, or when she was being playful, Marky. Never Marcus. "Marcus, please. It's so dark out here." The voice was closer now, maybe 20 feet away. Something rustled through the leaves, moving in a pattern that didn't match human locomotion. A wet, sliding sound followed, like meat being dragged across stone. "I can smell you," Sarah's voice said. And now it was wrong, too low and resonant, as if her throat had become a cave. "I can smell your fear. It's so sweet, Marcus, so warm." A hand fell on his shoulder. Marcus screamed and rolled away, scrambling on hands and knees toward where his flashlight had fallen. His fingers closed around the metal cylinder, and he swung it like a club, the beam sweeping across something that might have once been Sarah. Her face was there, recognizable but wrong, stretched over a frame that had too many joints, too many angles. Her eyes were black wells that seemed to pull at his sanity. "Why are you running from me?" she asked, and her voice came from everywhere at once, above, below, inside his own head. "We can be together now. Forever." The thing that wore Sarah's face stepped forward, and Marcus saw that her feet weren't touching the ground. She hovered inches above the forest floor, swaying gently like kelp in an underwater current. A rifle cracked through the night. The Sarah thing shrieked and whirled around, its borrowed face melting like wax. Marcus saw the old man step into the circle of flashlight, his weathered hands steady on an ancient hunting rifle. His eyes blazed with something that wasn't quite human. "Get behind me, boy," he growled, "and whatever happens, don't look back." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled to his feet and positioned himself behind the old man's broad shoulders, feeling small and helpless. The Guardian raised his rifle again, but Marcus could see his hands shaking now, as if whatever power he drew upon was costly. "You broke your oath," the Sarah thing hissed, its voice like steam escaping from a kettle. "The compact is void. The mountain remembers, Guardian. The mountain knows." The old man's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then let it know this too." The rifle spoke again, its voice echoing across the dark peaks like thunder. The ancient thing that had once been human pressed itself against the cavern wall, its elongated fingers scraping against stone as it listened to the approaching footsteps. Marcus could feel its hunger radiating through the darkness like heat from a furnace, could smell the decay that clung to its twisted form. Behind him, Sarah's breathing came in sharp, panicked gasps. "Stay absolutely still," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature's hearing had become supernaturally acute over the centuries, but its eyesight had deteriorated in the perpetual darkness of its domain. Movement would give them away instantly. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound that made Sarah's stomach clench. Through the narrow gap between the rocks where they hid, Marcus caught a glimpse of the thing as it passed. What he saw made his blood run cold. It had grown since their last encounter decades ago. Where once it had been merely tall and gaunt, now it stood nearly 8 feet in height. Its limbs stretched to impossible proportions. Its skin had taken on the pale, translucent quality of something that had never seen sunlight, and dark veins pulsed visibly beneath the surface. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, completely white, clouded over, yet somehow still aware. The creature paused directly in front of their hiding spot, its massive head tilting as it tested the air. Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him, and he slowly reached out to place a steadying hand on her arm. The simple touch seemed to calm her trembling. For what felt like an eternity, the thing remained motionless, listening. Then, with a sound like grinding bones, it turned and continued deeper into the cavern system. Only when its footsteps had faded completely did Marcus allow himself to breathe again. What was that? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the confined space. "One of the first," Marcus replied, checking his watch. The luminous dial showed 3:17 a.m. They had been in the caves for over 6 hours, and dawn was still far away. "It was a trapper, I think, back in the 1800s. Came up here looking for beaver pelts and found something else entirely. He had fought the creature before, years ago when it was smaller and weaker. Even then it had nearly killed him. Now, transformed by decades of feeding on the mountain's dark energy, it would be virtually unstoppable in direct combat. We need to keep moving," he said, helping Sarah to her feet. "There's another passage that leads toward the surface. If we're careful..." A scream echoed through the cavern system, high-pitched and desperate. It was followed by another, then the sound of something large crashing through the underground chambers. "The others," Sarah breathed. "Oh God, it found them." Marcus closed his eyes, fighting against the pull of his oath. For over a century, he had protected these mountains by keeping people away, by maintaining the barriers between the ancient evils and the innocent. But now, those same people were dying because of his failure, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to help. Another scream, weaker this time, decided the matter. "This way," he said, grabbing Sarah's hand and leading her back toward the main cavern. "Stay close to me, and whatever you see, don't stop running." They emerged from their hiding place into a nightmare. The cavern floor was slick with something dark and viscous, and the air reeked of copper and decay. In the distance, Marcus could see the glow of dropped flashlights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The creature's roar reverberated through the space as they ran, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sarah stumbled, and Marcus caught her, pulling her forward as loose rock rained down from the ceiling above. They rounded a corner and found Jake pressed against the far wall, his face white with terror. In his arms, he cradled Emma, who appeared to be unconscious but still breathing. Between them and the students, the ancient thing prowled back and forth, savoring their fear. It sensed Marcus's approach immediately, spinning around with inhuman speed. When it saw him, its lipless mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile, revealing rows of yellowed teeth that had grown too large for its jaw. "Guardian," it spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "You have broken your sacred trust. The barriers weaken with every step you take." Marcus felt the truth of those words in his bones. With each act of direct intervention, with every moment he spent in these cursed depths, the ancient seals that held back far worse things grew a little weaker. But looking at the terrified faces of the students, he found he no longer cared. "Let them go," he said, stepping forward. "Your quarrel is with me." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Guardian, you understand so little. They are already mine, as are you." The ancient hunger stirred in the depths of Shadow's hollow, responding to the spilled blood like a shark sensing chum in dark waters. Marcus felt it before he saw it, a wrongness that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The very air grew thick, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. "We need to move," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Jake, pressing her torn jacket against his wounded shoulder. "He can't walk. Look at him." Jake's face had gone waxy pale, his eyes unfocused. The claw marks weren't deep enough to be fatal, but the Shadowkin's touch carried something worse than physical damage. It drained the life force itself, leaving victims weak and disoriented. Marcus had seen it before, too many times. A low rumble echoed from the hollow behind them, followed by the sound of shifting stone. Something massive was awakening, disturbed by the scent of fresh blood and the death of its servant. Marcus's hand tightened on the silver-edged knife at his belt, knowing it would be useless against what was coming. "Listen to me carefully," he said, meeting each of their terrified gazes. "The Shadowkin was just a scout. Its death has alerted something much worse. We have perhaps 10 minutes before the hollow disgorges, things that will make tonight's encounter seem like a gentle nightmare." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the mild night air. "What kind of things?" Marcus didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved to Jake's other side and hauled the wounded student to his feet with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "Can you walk if we support you?" Jake nodded weakly, though his legs trembled with the effort of standing. "I think so." Another rumble, closer this time, accompanied by a sound like vast wings unfurling. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. He'd hoped they wouldn't wake the Devourer, but the Shadowkin's psychic death scream must have carried farther than he'd anticipated. "Change of plans," he said grimly. "We run." They stumbled through the darkness, Marcus supporting Jake's weight while Sarah and Emma flanked them. The Guardian's night vision allowed him to navigate the treacherous trail, but the students were nearly blind, stumbling over roots and rocks despite his whispered warnings. Behind them, the mountain began to sing, a deep thrumming note that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Marcus recognized the sound from his grandfather's stories, the Devourer's hunting call, a frequency that could drive men mad if they listened too long. He'd never heard it himself, had hoped he never would. "Cover your ears," he ordered. "Don't listen to the music." But it was already too late. Emma had stopped walking, her head tilted at an odd angle, as if straining to hear something beautiful and distant. Her eyes reflected the pale moonlight like polished glass. "Emma!" Sarah grabbed her friend's arm. "What's wrong with her?" "A call," Marcus said through gritted teeth. He shifted Jake's weight to Sarah and moved to Emma, gripping her face between his hands. "Emma, look at me. Focus on my voice, not the singing." The girl's lips moved soundlessly, her gaze fixed on something beyond the visible world. The Devourer's influence was already taking hold, drawing her consciousness toward the hollow where ancient hunger waited. Marcus had seen this before too, in the early days of his guardianship. He'd been too slow then, too hesitant to break the rules that bound him. Not tonight, not again. He pressed his thumb to Emma's forehead and spoke a word in the old language, the one his grandfather had made him swear never to use except in the direst circumstances. Power flowed through him, burning like acid in his veins, and Emma gasped as her awareness snapped back to the present. What? Where? She blinked rapidly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Move," Marcus commanded, already feeling the price of using forbidden magic. His vision wavered, and something warm trickled from his nose. The protection wards his family had maintained for generations were tied to strict rules about interference. Every act of direct intervention weakened them, and he'd already pushed far beyond safe limits tonight. They pressed on, half carrying Jake between them, while the mountain's song grew louder. More voices joined the original note, a hellish choir that spoke of hunger and endless night. Windows of pale light began to appear in the darkness behind them, moving with predatory purpose. Marcus knew they wouldn't make it to the safe zone at this pace. Jake was fading fast, and Emma kept stumbling as aftershocks from the Devourer's mental touch scrambled her nervous system. Sarah was doing her best, but she was just a college student facing horrors beyond human comprehension. He could save them. The knowledge burned in his mind like a brand. One more word in the old tongue, one final breaking of his oath, and he could transport them all to safety. But doing so would shatter the barriers completely, leaving every trail on the mountain open to the things that hunted in darkness. The lights grew closer. Soon, very soon, he would have to choose. The ancient cave system stretched deeper into the mountain than Sarah had imagined possible. The Guardian's torch cast dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, and she found herself gripping Marcus's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Behind them, Jake supported a barely conscious Emma, her breathing shallow and labored from whatever poison the shadow creatures had infected her with. "How much further?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps echoing through the narrow passages. The Guardian paused at a fork in the tunnel, studying markings that looked like they'd been scratched into the stone with inhuman claws. "We're close to the heart of their domain now. The hollow ones grow stronger here, but so do the old protections." He touched a symbol that glowed faintly blue at his contact. "These wards were carved by my people centuries ago. They still hold, barely." A distant shriek echoed from somewhere behind them, followed by an answering call that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emma stirred in Jake's arms, her eyes fluttering open with a look of terror that chilled Sarah's blood. "They're in my head," Emma gasped, her voice hoarse. "I can hear them whispering. They're so hungry and they know we're here, they're coming." The Guardian's expression darkened. He'd seen this before. The shadow poison didn't just weaken the body, it created a connection between victim and predator. Emma was becoming a beacon, drawing the creatures directly to them. "We need to move faster," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, the temperature in the cave plummeted, their breath began to mist, and frost started forming on the walls despite the deep underground location. Sarah felt it before she saw it, a presence pressing against her mind like ice-cold fingers probing for weakness. The shadows behind them deepened impossibly, and shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Not the quick, darting forms they'd encountered on the trail, but something far worse. These were older, more substantial, with eyes like burning coals and limbs that stretched and contracted like liquid smoke. "Run!" the Guardian commanded, but his voice carried a note Sarah had never heard before. Fear. They stumbled forward through passages that seemed to twist and change around them. The walls themselves appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the mountain were a living thing. The symbols carved into the stone pulsed with increasingly desperate light, some flickering and dying as the ancient power that sustained them finally gave out. Jake stumbled, nearly dropping Emma as exhaustion took its toll. The Guardian caught them both, his supernatural strength the only thing keeping their small group together. But Sarah could see the strain in his face, the way his jaw clenched with each step. Whatever power he drew upon was not unlimited, and they'd been pushing hard for what felt like hours. The passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Ancient pillars rose from the floor like the ribs of some massive beast, each one covered in the same protective symbols they'd seen throughout the caves. But here, many of the markings were dark, their power long since faded. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface stained with what looked like centuries of dried blood. The air around it shimmered with an otherworldly energy that made Sarah's teeth ache just to look at it. "The binding stone," the Guardian said, his voice filled with a mixture of reverence and dread. "This is where my ancestors first contained the Hollow Ones, trapping them in the deep places of the mountain. It's also the only place where the connection between Emma and the creatures can be severed." Emma's eyes snapped open, suddenly alert and focused with an intelligence that wasn't entirely her own. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that belonged to something ancient and hungry. "You cannot save them, Guardian. Your oath binds you to watch, not to act. You have already broken sacred law by bringing them here. Release the girl to us, and we will consider your transgression forgiven." The Guardian's hand moved to the knife at his belt, its blade gleaming with the same blue light as the protective symbols. "My oath was to protect the innocent from your kind. That oath stands above all others." Behind them, the shadows were gathering, flowing into the chamber like a dark tide. The temperature continued to drop until their breath came in sharp puffs of white vapor. Sarah could hear whispers in languages that predated human civilization, promises of power and threats of torments that would last beyond death. The Guardian stepped toward the altar, Emma's possessed form tracking his movement with predatory intensity. "There's a ritual," he said, speaking to Sarah and Marcus without taking his eyes off the growing darkness. "It will break their hold on her, but the cost..." He paused, his jaw working as if the words themselves were poison. "The cost will be everything." The ancient chamber trembled as Marcus stepped through the breach in the stone barrier, his weathered boots crunching on fragments of obsidian that had sealed this place for centuries. Behind him, the surviving students huddled together, Sarah clutching her injured arm, Jake supporting a limping Emma, and Derek's eyes wide with terror that had finally broken through his bravado. The air inside reeked of decay and something else, something primordial that made their skin crawl. Phosphorescent symbols carved into the walls provided an eerie blue-green glow, revealing the true scope of what they faced. The chamber stretched far beyond what should have been possible, its ceiling lost in shadow, and everywhere, coating the walls like some grotesque wallpaper, were bones. Human bones, animal bones, things that might have been bones, but belonged to creatures that had never walked under sunlight. "Jesus Christ," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "He has no power here," Marcus said grimly, checking the ammunition in his rifle. "This place predates your god by millennia." Sarah pressed closer to the group, her medical training warring with her basic human need to flee. "What is this place?" "A feeding ground," Marcus replied, scanning the shadows ahead. The hollow ones built it as a larder, somewhere to store their acquisitions until they were ready to feast. A sound echoed from the depths of the chamber, not quite a growl, not quite a whisper, but something that vibrated in their bones and made their teeth ache. The students instinctively moved closer together, while Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between them and whatever lurked in the darkness. "They know we're here," he said, his voice steady despite the impossibility of their situation. "They've been waiting for fresh meat to wander into their domain." Emma's breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "How many are there?" "In here? Dozens. Maybe more." Marcus's eyes never stopped moving, tracking shadows that seemed to shift independently of the flickering symbols. "They've been trapped in this chamber since I sealed it 50 years ago. They're hungry, and they're angry." The first one emerged from the shadows like smoke given form. It had once been human. The basic shape was still recognizable, but centuries in this place had twisted it into something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at impossible angles, and its face was a canvas of suffering that had been stretched over far too many years. Sarah bit back a scream as more shapes began to materialize from the darkness. Some crawled along the walls like spiders, others shambled forward on legs that creaked like old wood. All of them shared the same hollow eyes, the same expression of eternal hunger. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice cutting through their terror. "Stay in the light from the symbols. Don't look directly into their eyes for more than a moment. They can pull your soul out through your pupils. And whatever you do, don't let them touch you. Their corruption spreads through contact." "How are we supposed to fight them?" Jake demanded, hefting a piece of broken stone. "You're not," Marcus said, raising his rifle. "I am." The first shot echoed through the chamber like thunder, and the nearest hollow one exploded into wisps of shadow and ancient dust. But immediately, 3 more took its place, moving with inhuman speed across the bone-littered floor. Marcus worked the bolt action with practiced efficiency, each shot precisely placed. But for every creature he destroyed, 2 more seemed to emerge from the deeper shadows. They were being overwhelmed, pushed steadily back toward the entrance they'd come through. "The symbols!" Sarah suddenly called out, pointing at the glowing marks on the walls. "They're getting dimmer!" She was right. The phosphorescent glow was fading, and with it, their only source of protection. As the light weakened, the hollow ones grew bolder, pressing closer to the small circle of survivors. Marcus's rifle clicked empty. He reached for another magazine, but a hollow one was already lunging toward Emma with claws that gleamed like black metal. Without thinking, he threw himself forward, tackling the creature and sending them both crashing into the bone-covered wall. Pain exploded through his shoulder as those claws raked across his flesh, but worse than the physical agony was the immediate sensation of wrongness that spread from the wounds. The corruption was already beginning its work, trying to hollow him out from the inside. But Marcus had spent 70 years preparing for this moment. "Now!" he roared, pulling a strange metal device from his coat. "Run for the far wall, follow the spiral carved into the stone." "We're not leaving you!" Sarah shouted back. "You are!" Marcus's voice carried absolute authority as he triggered the device. It began to emit a high-pitched whine that made the hollow ones recoil in obvious pain. "This is my purpose. This is why I've lived so long. Go!" The device's whine grew louder, and cracks began to appear in its metal casing. Marcus smiled grimly as he realized what he'd always known. Some battles could only be won through sacrifice. The ancient tree's bark felt rough against Sarah's back as she pressed herself into its shadow, her breathing shallow and controlled. The whispering had grown louder, closer, and she could see movement in her peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to flow like liquid between the pines. Her hands trembled as she gripped the silver pendant Marcus had given her, its surface warm against her palm. 20 feet away, Jake crouched behind a fallen log, his face pale in the moonlight. Blood still seeped from the scratches on his arms where the shadow thing had raked him before Marcus arrived. The Guardian's intervention had saved his life, but at what cost? They'd watched in horror as Marcus collapsed, his strength finally failing after decades of holding back the darkness. A branch snapped somewhere to their left, and Sarah bit back a gasp. The creatures were hunting them, circling like wolves, scenting wounded prey. She could feel their hunger, an almost physical pressure against her mind that made her skull ache. The pendant grew warmer, pushing back against the invasive presence, but she knew it wouldn't last long. "Sarah," Jake's voice was barely a whisper, carried on the wind. He pointed toward a cluster of rocks 30 yards ahead where Marcus lay motionless. "We have to get to him." She nodded, though every instinct screamed against leaving the relative safety of the tree. But Marcus was their only hope of survival. Without him, they were just prey waiting to be devoured. The shadows moved again, and this time, Sarah saw them clearly. 3 of the creatures emerged from the tree line, their forms shifting and unstable like smoke given malevolent purpose. Their eyes were holes in reality itself, darker than the spaces between stars. One of them turned its head toward her hiding spot with predatory intelligence. "Now," Jake hissed. They ran, abandoning stealth for speed. Sarah's boots pounded against the rocky ground as the pendant bounced against her chest, its glow intensifying with each step. Behind them, the creatures shrieked, a sound like wind through broken glass that made her ears ring. She didn't look back. Jake reached Marcus first, dropping to his knees beside the Guardian's still form. "He's breathing," he called out as Sarah skidded to a stop. But barely. Marcus's skin was ashen, his breathing labored. The iron bracelet on his wrist had turned black, and dark veins spread up his arm like ink in water. Whatever power he'd used to drive back the creatures was consuming him from within. "The ward stones," Marcus whispered, his eyes fluttering open. "Have to reached the ward stones. Sarah looked around frantically. Where? I don't see any. Beyond the ridge. Marcus struggled to sit up, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Ancient circle. Only way to send them back. The creatures had regrouped, moving through the trees with renewed purpose. Sarah could see more of them now, dozens of shadow forms sliding between the pines like a tide of living darkness. They seemed to grow bolder as Marcus weakened, their whispers rising to an excited chorus. Can you walk? Jake asked, hauling Marcus to his feet. The Guardians swayed, but managed to stay upright. Have to try. They're breaking through the barriers I set decades ago. Without the ward stones. He didn't need to finish. Sarah could see the truth in his haunted eyes. This wasn't just about their survival anymore. If these creatures escaped the mountain, if they spread beyond the ancient boundaries that had contained them, the carnage would be unimaginable. They moved as quickly as Marcus's condition allowed, half carrying him up the steep slope toward the ridge. The creatures followed, their numbers growing with each passing minute as more emerged from whatever hellish realm they called home. The air grew thick with malevolence, pressing against them like a physical weight. There, Marcus gasped, pointing ahead. Sarah saw them. 7 standing stones arranged in a perfect circle on a flat outcropping of rock. Even from a distance, she could feel their power, older than civilization, older than human memory. But something was wrong. Several of the stones were cracked, their surfaces dark with corruption. They've been poisoning the wards, Marcus said, reading her expression. For years, slowly weakening them. Tonight was their breakthrough. The first creature reached the base of the ridge, its form more solid now, more real. Sarah could see its claws, black as obsidian and sharp enough to part reality itself. Others flanked it, their movements coordinated with terrifying intelligence. What do we do? Jake demanded. Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out a knife, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Its blade seemed to drink in the moonlight, and ancient symbols were carved into its bone handle. Blood magic, he said. The old ways, but it requires a willing sacrifice. Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of sacrifice? Before Marcus could answer, the creatures began their final assault, flowing up the slope like a black tide. Their shrieks filled the air, drowning out all other sound. The pendant against Sarah's chest burned like fire, and she knew their time had run out. The circle of stones loomed ahead, humanity's last hope against an ancient evil. The screaming had stopped. Marcus pressed himself against the cold stone of the cave wall, straining to hear beyond the thunderous beating of his own heart. Outside, the wind carried only silence, a silence more terrifying than any sound the Wendigo had made. Sarah's ragged breathing echoed somewhere in the darkness beside him, but he couldn't see her. The Guardian's makeshift torch had died minutes ago, leaving them in absolute blackness. Is it gone? Sarah's whisper barely reached him. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. The Guardian had made it clear that the creatures hunted by sound, by scent, by the very essence of fear that rolled off them in waves. Speaking meant death. Moving meant death. Even thinking too loudly might draw them back. But the silence stretched on, and Marcus began to wonder if staying still might also mean death. A scraping sound echoed from the cave's entrance. Deliberate, methodical, not the frantic clawing of a beast, but something else, something purposeful. Marcus held his breath until his lungs burned, fighting the urge to gasp for air. It's me. The Guardian's voice, barely audible, cut through the darkness like salvation. Marcus nearly sobbed with relief, but caught himself. Even relief could be dangerous here. The faint glow of a new torch flickered to life, revealing the Guardian's bloodied form silhouetted against the cave opening. His coat hung in tatters, dark stains spreading across the fabric. Deep gashes ran along his left arm, and his weathered face bore fresh scratches that looked like they'd been carved by razor wire. How many? Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. 3 down. The Guardian's eyes swept the cave, ensuring they were alone. But there are more. They're calling to others across the mountain. We have perhaps an hour before this place becomes a hunting ground, unlike anything you can imagine. Marcus struggled to his feet. his legs weak from terror and cold. "Where can we go? You said there was no safe place on the trail after dark." "There isn't." The Guardian moved deeper into the cave, examining the walls with his torch. "But there's something else, something I swore I would never use again." He pressed his palm against what looked like solid stone. Ancient symbols began to glow beneath his touch, carved so deep into the rock that they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The air grew thick, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. "What is that?" Sarah stepped closer, mesmerized by the growing luminescence. "A doorway." The Guardian's voice carried the weight of old regret, the same kind the Wendigo used to travel between our world and theirs. "My people sealed most of them centuries ago, but this one we kept as a last resort." The symbols flared brighter, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift in the air around them. The cave walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched his terrified pulse. Through the growing light, he could see the outline of a passage that hadn't been there moments before. "Where does it lead?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Away from here. To the other side of the mountain, near the ranger station." The Guardian's hand trembled against the stone, but crossing over, "It changes you, marks you. The things that hunt in the spaces between worlds will always be able to find you." A howl echoed from somewhere far below them, answered by another from the ridge above. Then another, and another. The mountain itself seemed to be awakening, filled with hungry voices that spoke of nothing but endless appetite. "How many people have you saved this way?" Sarah asked. "None." The Guardian's admission hung in the air like smoke, "Because I swore I never would. The price is too high. But tonight..." He looked at them both, these young people who had stumbled into a nightmare beyond their comprehension, and Marcus saw something break behind the old man's eyes. "Tonight, I'm breaking more than one sacred oath." The howling grew closer. Through the cave entrance, Marcus caught glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows that moved wrong, too tall and angular to be anything natural. The Guardian was right, they were calling others. Soon this mountain would crawl with things that had no business existing in the same world as college students and hiking trails and normal human fears. "If we go through," Sarah said, her voice steady despite everything, "what happens to you?" The Guardian's smile was grim. "I stay. Someone has to seal it behind you, and someone has to make sure they don't follow. This is my mountain, my responsibility." The passage through the stone grew wider, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. Cool air flowed through it, carrying scents of pine and morning dew, normal smells from a normal world that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. "Choose quickly," the Guardian said. "They're almost here." The ancient stone chamber trembled as Marcus pressed his palm against the obsidian altar, feeling the pulse of malevolent energy beneath his fingertips. The Shadowkin had retreated to the deepest part of their domain, but he could sense their presence like a cancer in the mountain's heart. Sarah stood behind him, her breathing shallow and quick in the suffocating darkness. "The binding ritual," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing off the carved walls. "It's the only way to seal them permanently." Sarah's flashlight beam wavered as she swept it across the chamber. Ancient symbols covered every surface, etched deep into the black stone by hands long dead. "What do you need me to do?" Marcus pulled the weathered leather journal from his pack, its pages yellow with age and stained with blood. His grandfather's handwriting seemed to glow in the pale light as he found the ritual's instructions. The words were in a language that predated human civilization, taught to him by the mountain spirits when he first accepted his burden. "The Guardian's blood must be freely given," he read aloud, his voice tight with understanding. "A life willingly sacrificed to strengthen the ancient barriers." "No," Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "There has to be another way." The shadows around them began to writhe and coalesce, taking shape as the Shadowkin prepared for another assault. Their whispers filled the chamber like the sound of wind through dead leaves, speaking promises of eternal torment in voices that scraped against sanity. Marcus met Sarah's desperate gaze. "This is why I tried to keep you away. Why I've lived alone for so many years." He touched her face gently, memorizing the warmth of her skin. Some battles can only be won through sacrifice. A bone-chilling shriek echoed from the tunnel behind them. The remaining Shadowkin were massing for a final attack, their forms becoming more solid as they fed on the fear and despair that permeated the ancient chamber. Marcus could see their true shapes now, twisted amalgamations of human and beast, with eyes like burning coals and claws that could tear through both flesh and soul. "Start the ritual," Sarah said suddenly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But let me help you find another way." Marcus wanted to argue, but the shadows were already reaching for them with grasping tendrils of darkness. He began to chant in the old tongue, his voice growing stronger with each word. The obsidian altar responded, glowing with an inner fire that pushed back the encroaching darkness. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her hand covering his on the ancient stone. To his amazement, the symbols began to pulse brighter, as if her presence amplified the ritual's power. The Shadowkin recoiled, their shrieks of rage echoing through the mountain. "Your grandfather's journal," Sarah gasped, understanding flooding her features. "Look at the next page." Marcus turned the brittle parchment and found words he had never seen before, written in his grandfather's hand, but glowing with supernatural light. A second ritual, hidden until this moment, one that required not death, but the willing bond between guardian and witness, creating a dual barrier that could withstand the ancient evil. The Shadowkin sensed the change and attacked with desperate fury. Marcus raised his silver blade, cutting through their essence, while Sarah continued to channel power through the altar. The chamber filled with blinding light, as the mountain itself seemed to respond to their combined will. Together, Marcus shouted over the supernatural storm raging around them. "Speak the words with me!" Their voices joined in the ancient incantation. Sarah, somehow understanding the alien syllables as if they were written in her very DNA. The obsidian altar cracked down its center, releasing centuries of stored energy in a pulse that shattered the Shadowkin's forms and sent their essence screaming back into the void. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the mountain seemed to hold its breath as the last echoes of the banishing ritual faded away. The symbols on the walls glowed once more, then dimmed to nothing, leaving only ordinary stone carved by forgotten hands. Marcus staggered, feeling the familiar weight of his guardian's burden, but changed somehow, no longer alone in his eternal watch. Sarah's hand remained on his, and he could sense her presence like a warm light in his mind, a connection forged by blood and ancient magic. "It's done," he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Sarah nodded, exhaustion clear in her features but her eyes bright with purpose. "The binding will hold, but only as long as we maintain it together." Outside the chamber, the first hints of dawn were beginning to filter through the mountain passages. They had fought through the longest night, but morning had come at last. As they made their way toward the surface, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope for a future that didn't end in solitary death. The mountain would have its guardians, but they would no longer stand alone against the darkness. The ancient clearing pulsed with malevolent energy as Marcus led the survivors deeper into the heart of the forbidden territory. Sarah clutched his arm, her face pale in the ethereal moonlight that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath their feet. Behind them, Jake supported Emma, who had barely regained consciousness after their encounter with the shadow creatures. "This is madness," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "We're walking straight into their den." Marcus's weathered hand tightened on his silver blade, the metal humming with an otherworldly resonance. "The only way out is through. The hunger grows stronger with each passing hour. If we don't end this tonight, it will spread beyond these mountains." The trees around them twisted into unnatural shapes, their barks scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Sarah felt her sanity fraying at the edges as whispers in a language older than human civilization echoed from the darkness between the trunks. "How do you know all this?" Emma managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "What aren't you telling us?" Marcus stopped walking, his shoulders sagging under the weight of centuries. When he turned to face them, his eyes held depths of sorrow that made Sarah's heart ache. "Because I created it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake took a step backward, his face contorting with betrayal and fear. "What do you mean you created it?" 200 years ago I was like you," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "Young, foolish, convinced I could master forces beyond mortal understanding. I found the old texts, performed the rituals, opened doorways that should have remained sealed forever." Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "The Guardian, you're not protecting us from it. I'm its keeper," Marcus finished, "bound by cosmic law to contain what I unleashed. Every soul it claims, every life lost to my arrogance, weighs on me like a stone." A bone-chilling howl erupted from the forest behind them, followed by the sound of massive bodies crashing through undergrowth. The shadow creatures had found their trail. "Move," Marcus commanded, pushing them toward a ring of standing stones that materialized from the mist ahead. "We need to reach the nexus before they surround us." They ran through the nightmare landscape as reality itself seemed to unravel around them. The ground beneath their feet shifted between solid earth and something that felt disturbingly organic. Sarah glimpsed things moving in her peripheral vision, writhing tentacles of darkness, eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence, shapes that her mind refused to process. The standing stones loomed before them, each one carved with protective wards that glowed with fading light. At the center of the circle sat an obsidian altar, its surface covered in constellations of dried blood. "The binding ritual," Marcus explained as they stumbled into the circle. "I can seal the breach permanently, but it requires a willing sacrifice. The Guardian's life force, freely given." Emma shook her head frantically. "There has to be another way. You can't just—" "Look around you," Marcus snapped. "The hunger is breaking free. By dawn it will reach the valley below. Thousands will die, and it will only grow stronger." The shadow creatures emerged from the tree line, their forms more solid and terrifying than before. Sarah could see details now that she wished she couldn't. Faces within their writhing darkness, mouths full of needle teeth, claws that dripped with something that steamed when it hit the ground. "The wards won't hold them for long," Marcus said, pulling a leather-bound tome from his pack. The book's pages fluttered open of their own accord, revealing text that seemed to writhe and shift. "When I begin the incantation, the protective circle will fail. You'll have maybe 30 seconds to reach the trail back to town." Sarah grabbed his arm. "We're not leaving you." A sad smile crossed his weathered features. "You don't have a choice. This is my penance, my responsibility. I've carried this burden for 2 centuries, watching good people die because of my mistakes." The first shadow creature tested the barrier, its claws striking sparks from the invisible wall. Cracks appeared in the air itself, spreading like broken glass. Marcus raised the tome and began to chant in the ancient tongue. The words tore at Sarah's mind, each syllable causing physical pain as reality bent around them. The obsidian altar began to glow with sickly green light, and she felt a terrible pulling sensation, as if the very essence of life was being drawn toward it. The protective circle shattered like crystal. Shadow creatures poured into the clearing, their alien shrieks drowning out Marcus's incantation. But something was wrong. Instead of attacking, they seemed to be fleeing, streaming past the humans toward the forest beyond. From the darkness between the standing stones, something infinitely worse began to emerge. The true hunger, awakened by the ritual, ancient beyond measure and terrible beyond description. Marcus looked up from the tome, his face pale with realization. "I miscalculated. The binding. It's not working." The thing in the darkness laughed, and the sound promised an eternity of suffering. The ancient symbols carved into Marcus's flesh blazed with silver fire as he pressed his bleeding palms against the obsidian altar. The Wendigo's screams echoed through the cavern, its ethereal form writhing as the binding ritual tore at its essence. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as tendrils of shadow peeled away from the creature like burning paper. "The blood of the willing guardian," Marcus gasped, his voice barely audible over the supernatural storm raging around them. "It's the only way to seal them forever." The surviving students, Sarah, Jake, and Emma, huddled together near the cave entrance, their faces pale in the supernatural light. They had followed Marcus deeper into the mountain's heart, past chambers filled with the bones of ancient victims, to this place where the veil between worlds wore thin. Marcus's grandfather had brought him here once, decades ago, to show him the source of their family's burden. The altar was older than recorded history, carved from stone that seemed to drink in light. It was here that the first guardian had made his pact, trading his bloodline's freedom for the power to hold back the darkness. "You don't have to do this," Sarah called out, though her voice was nearly lost in the howling wind that had risen from nowhere. "There has to be another way." Marcus turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes the weight of generations. The silver markings on his skin pulsed brighter, and she realized they weren't tattoos at all. They were scars carved deep into his flesh by forces beyond mortal understanding. "There is no other way," he said. "This is what I was born for." The Wendigo lunged forward, its claws raking across his chest, but the creature's touch only made the symbols burn brighter. Marcus grabbed the thing by its throat, his fingers sinking into flesh that was neither fully solid nor completely spirit. The contact sent shockwaves through both of them. Ancient words poured from Marcus's lips, syllables that had never been meant for human tongues. The language of the first people, the ones who had walked these mountains when the world was young and the barriers between realms were gossamer thin. Each word cost him, bleeding away pieces of his life force, but the binding grew stronger. The altar began to crack beneath their struggle, hairline fractures spreading outward like a spider web. From those cracks seeped a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on everything in the chamber. Sarah felt it trying to crawl into her mind, whispering promises of power and eternal hunger. "Don't listen," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying an authority that cut through the supernatural interference. "Cover your ears. Close your eyes. Whatever it shows you, it's lies." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the toll the ritual was taking. Marcus's hair had gone white, and deep lines carved themselves across his face as decades of contained aging caught up with him in moments. The Guardian's power was consuming him from within, just as it had consumed his grandfather and his great-grandfather and all the ones who came before. The Wendigo's form began to compress, drawn inexorably toward the fractured altar. Its screams took on a note of genuine terror as it realized what was happening. This wasn't just banishment or temporary binding, this was obliteration, a complete severing from the world of the living. "The others," the creature hissed, its voice like breaking glass. "You cannot hold them all, Guardian. When you are gone, they will remember the taste of flesh. They will hunt." Marcus smiled grimly, blood running from his eyes like tears. "Then the next Guardian will be ready." He pressed his forehead against the Wendigo's skull, and the silver fire that had been building within him exploded outward. The creature's scream cut off abruptly as it was pulled apart at the molecular level, its essence scattered beyond any hope of reformation. The darkness pouring from the altar retreated, sealing itself away as the ancient stones fused back together. Marcus collapsed, his body hitting the cavern floor with a sound like breaking branches. Sarah rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. His breathing was shallow, labored, but his eyes were clear. "It's done," he whispered. "The old compact is fulfilled, the way is sealed." "What happens now?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. Marcus managed a weak smile. "Now you go home, live your lives. Remember that there are still those who stand guard in the dark places of the world." His hand found the leather pouch at his belt, the one containing his grandfather's journal. With trembling fingers, he pressed it into Sarah's hands. "Tell the story," he said. "Make sure it's remembered." The light in his eyes dimmed and went out. Marcus Clearwater, last guardian of the mountain, was finally at rest. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Montana peaks, painting the snow-covered slopes in shades of gold and rose. The forbidden trail was quiet now, its secrets buried once more beneath stone and silence.